So welcome along to the Coaching Corner on this first day of spring or first day of fall, depending on which part of the world you're in. I need to move you guys over here. So welcome to today's episode of Zedu's Coaching Corner. I'm your host, Suean Pascoe. If you have not done so yet, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And for all the ultrasound educators out there, feel free to sign up to our Facebook community. It's a new community. We've only started it, I think, since our last Coaching Corner, and it's under the POCUS Educators and Seed Support Network. I want to let everybody know that this session is being recorded and it will be available for you to view on our website in the next few days, along with all the other episodes of the Coaching Corner. And I think tonight is the episode number 29. Feel free to ask questions along the way. And if you'd rather ask questions offline, just let me know and we'll save them for the end and turn off the recording. So I'm also going to tell you about, before we get too far into this, I just wanted to tell you about our Train the Ultrasound Trainer program. It's being held in Melbourne in October on the 22nd and the 23rd. We can also bring this to you and your team wherever you are in the world. I've done it to Denmark during lockdown, which was such a shame. I would have loved to have gone, but we've been to America. I've done this to Longreach over the Zoom. So anyway, we can bring it to you if you have a team of people who are needing to upskill in their teaching skills. So it's a good way to learn how to structure your ultrasound teaching to make the learning easy for your students and make life a lot simpler for you. So if you want to have a look at the full breakdown of the program, head on over to our website at ultrasoundtraining.com.au. So tonight's topic is how to communicate the probe moves. This seems like such an obvious and easy thing to do, and it's just so very important to get it right. And certainly my experience has been that when we changed up our program and got all of our tutors speaking the same language and did a dedicated session teaching the probe skills, we started to see results happening on day 2 that used to take until day 4 or 5 of a course. So our experience has been that this stuff absolutely matters. And so hopefully during the course of this next half an hour or so, I want to talk to you about what is the common words, or what are the words we use, why do I use those ones, and just some tips and tricks for you as an instructor to improve your skills on teaching people with a hands-off teaching approach. Have you ever had a learner who looks confused or just plain lost, or you're frustrated because they just don't seem to be listening? Now, often they can just be so overwhelmed with what's going on, or they might be trying to translate, what do you actually mean? You know, I was working with Sally yesterday and Sally said this and you're saying this word, and well, what probe move do you actually want me to use? And so if this is common at your place, one of the simplest and easiest things for you to do is to use a common lexicon. And in the next half an hour or so, we're going to talk through 10 top tips. And some of what I'm going to say today is just so obvious, almost as obvious as the nose on your face. This is stuff that you do every single day. The problem is this stuff is so automatic for you and so buried deep in your conscience because you've done it over and over again that it makes it hard to sort of step back into your learner's shoes and approach this as a novice user again. And we can't ever quite inhabit our learner's shoes because even if we're 2 weeks ahead of them, we're already employing mental shortcuts and already have figured out some of the things that they're still struggling with. So what I want to do today is to bring out some of those teaching points and some of those tips and make it really obvious. And like I said, I might be telling you that this is the nose, it's in the middle of your face. But if I can make it conscious for you so that you can exaggerate these things, it'll make your teaching much, much easier. So my first top tip is teach the fundamentals. What do I mean? We need to start with things like the probe has a probe marker. The anatomy that demonstrates on the side of that probe marker will always demonstrate on the same side as this screen indicator. Now, it doesn't matter which way around you have your screen indicator, whether you're in a general setting or in a cardiac imaging convention. The anatomy on the side of the probe marker will always demonstrate on the side of the screen marker. The other thing we need to really talk through and explain is that at the top of the sector, or closest to the sector, is the skin, and at the bottom of the probe is deep. Now, it depends where we put the probe. If we put the probe on the front, that's also anterior and posterior. If we put the probe on the right side, that's right lateral, and the bottom of the screen will be medial. Top of the screen is always superficial. We go down in layers, bottom of the screen is always deep. Now, the two sides of the probe, here's where things get confusing, because it depends which way we're holding our probe, which way and what side is which here. So the general imaging convention, and everyone's very familiar with this, but in the general imaging convention, in a transverse lie, we point the probe to the patient's right side, and in a longer, and that makes the image on the left of your screen the patient's right, and the image and the anatomy on the right of your screen the patient's left. And when we do a longitudinal image, we put that probe marker to the patient's head, which means left of screen is superior and right of screen is inferior. The cardiac team are all back to front, and the confusing view here is the parasternal long axis view. And so we put the probe marker to the patient's right shoulder. And the other thing about cardiac that's confusing is the base and apex is also upside down. So it does follow the rules though. The anatomy under the probe marker will demonstrate on the same side as the screen marker, even though their screen marker is on the other side. So that does give us apex and base, or right and left of screen. The other, another important thing that our students need to understand, much like a CT scan, we need to create many slices to build up a full picture of what's going on. Now, in the CT scan, the patient lies on the bed and the bed is moved through a stationary camera, and there's several pictures taken, so we have several slices. And a CT scan is useless if we only had one image given to us. Well, maybe it was useful if the pathology happened to be in that slice, but you need a series of images to determine where the pathology is and to build up that three-dimensional picture. So when we're looking at ultrasound, we have to move the probe now. The patient stays still, and we have to move the probe to create those slices to build up that three-dimensional picture. And we need to scan in two planes to build up that three-dimensional picture. It's important that our learners understand that there is a long and a short axis of the probe, and that there is a long and a short axis of the target. What we are trying to do is align the long axis of our probe with the long axis of our target anatomy. Now, the challenge here is it's not straight up and down like in other imaging modalities. So depending on what organ we're looking at or where our target is, what the long axis plane looks like. So the gallbladder, for instance, is oblique on the body. The pancreas in its long axis is horizontal on the body, so it would be a transverse orientation of the probe. And lucky for us, some things do run straight up and down. Now, this all gets really confusing when we look at babies. It depends what way baby is. Now, you start the scan and we want to look at mum's anatomy, but then when we move on to baby, it depends on where that baby happens to be lying, and we need to orientate our long axis of the probe with the long axis of the baby. So then they need to understand that movement along the length of the probe will put the anatomy in the middle of the picture. And so we can slide the probe along its length, and that will change our position relative to the anatomy. Or we can rock the probe along its length, and we will see different parts of the anatomy. This also means that we can bring anatomy that's at the edge of our image into the middle. Movement across the width of the probe will create the scans. So if we sweep the probe, we will create several slices, and we're perpendicular to our target. The other option we have, of course, is to fan the probe. And so if we angle the probe along that length of the probe out to the side, we can create the slices. They're just now at a slight angle. So our next top tip is to use very clear and precise language, and this gets to the heart of it. I'm going to talk through the language that we use. But more importantly, I think it's super important to understand that you need to use common language. So there are many words. We have pivot. Chris has just spoken and said he uses the word twist. There's fanning, sweeping, heel toeing the probe. I don't know about you, but I look at a probe and I can't see a heel side and a toe side. It kind of makes sense, sure, but does it make sense because that's what I learned because someone showed me one time? I know when I say heel toe to a novice user, they kind of look at the probe and go, which side's the heel, which side's the toe, and you just draw this blank face. So I know that's a popular one. I still do use it interchangeably sometimes for those learners who've been introduced to that terminology. There's words like rock, tilt, rotate, slide, angle, translate, move the probe. Move the probe is one of my favorites. It's like it can move in many different directions. Which way do you want me to move it? The important thing here is that we need a common language and our student needs to understand the language that we're speaking. As I mentioned right at the beginning, if we wind back the clock maybe 7 years ago, we had 3 or 4 tutors teaching a group of students, and our students would rotate between those tutors. And none of us were using any sort of standardized and consistent terminology. And so we were struggling with our learners kind of going from bed 1 to 2 going, well, she said this move and that, and what do you want me to do? Hang on, let me think about that. Let me translate it. What I want to be doing is giving an instruction, having my instruction understood and having the action be automatic. That just makes your teaching so much easier. And the way we go about doing that is to pretty much program the students very early on, program them for want of a better word, so that they are so familiar with those terms that if I say rock, they just automatically rock. Now, it takes a bit of time to get there. It certainly takes more than 5 minutes. But if all you've got is 5 minutes to at least go through the words and introduce them to the terminology, that's better than nothing. No matter which words you're using, and as I've mentioned, there are many different words that you can use. No matter which words you're using, it's really important that there's consistency. If you sit a bunch of ultrasound educators around the table and all tried to come to some sort of consensus about which words you're going to use, there will be vigorous debate. Inevitably, someone just needs to say, here's what we're doing. That's what we've had to do here, is just go, these are the words we're using. And it's based on what's been published in the literature. So here's the words that we're using. And then it takes a little while for you as a tutor to get those words familiar in your own head. And so you are kind of second guessing yourself for a while, but it is worth the effort. And it certainly accelerates the learner's progress. So the reason why we use the terminology we did, if we look back 2007, I think the AIUM published an article and it had 5 probe moves, and it used the word slide, and slide was movement either along the y-axis or the x-axis of the probe. And so when you gave the instruction to slide, there's still a couple of different ways that you can go. So which way do we need to do it? And you always had to add extra instruction, which then increases the cognitive load for the learner. So thankfully, Dr. David Boehner and his team at Ohio State University in Ohio wrote this paper in 2016, The Language of Transducer Manipulation. It's been published in the Journal of Ultrasound in Medicine, and he was pretty much defining the probe moves along the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis. So movements along the left axis was sweep and fan, movements along the y-axis, slide and rock, and movements along the z-axis is pressure or compression and rotate. Now, I've found through lots and lots of teaching, there's one more word that needs to be added to this nomenclature. So we've got 7 words now. Sweep and fan is along the x-axis. Slide and rock is along the y-axis. Compress and rotate is along the z-axis. And so the other word that's really helpful, and this is fine-tuning. We kind of introduce this a bit later, but this is really fine-tuning the probe moves. And this takes care of that crown rump length that you just can't get quite right. And it's all about optimizing the image. and it's pivot. And I'm going to talk about what the difference between rotate and pivot is in a moment. So we're going to go through each one of these separately. The first one is sweep. Well, we've all used a broom before. I hope we've all used a broom before. And you move the broom across its short axis to push the dirt along the floor. That's essentially what we're doing with the probe. We are staying perpendicular to our target, and we are moving or translating the probe across its short axis or across its width. Now, the way I remember the difference between sweep and slide, sweep has the W across the width, slide has the L along the length. Now, when we sweep the probe, what we're doing is creating the slices and building up the scan of the organ. We keep our angle of inclination perpendicular to our target so we get the best reflection, and we are physically moving the probe to create the slices. Now, the next one along the x-axis is fan, and this one you sort of hold like when you're using a Chinese fan. You hold one end still and you're swinging the distal end of the probe. So the probe face stays still on the patient and you move the handle. And what happens here is you create slices and you build up a picture with many slices, but those slices now are at a slightly different angle of inclination. And so usually to create the scan of an organ, you need to sweep and fan. Typically, we want to sweep first to stay perpendicular to our target, and fan is how we extend the window. So for example, I'm scanning the bladder, I sweep down until I hit the symphysis pubis, and then I can't see behind the symphysis pubis, so I fan my probe inferiorly to expand my field of view. And so both sweep and fan create the scan. Sweep is perpendicular to the target, and fan, you're creating a slight angle of inclination. And so movement along the long axis of the probe, as I mentioned before, slide, SL for the length of the probe. There is only one way that you can safely go down a slippery slide. And so movement along the length of the probe is a slide movement. So we translate along the probe's length. Now, when we do this, what happens is that we change our view or the position of our view relative to the anatomy. And so I can look at the top end of the kidney or the bottom end of the kidney, and I maintain perpendicularity with the target. Rock is along the long axis of the probe. And again, you can only rock forwards and backwards on this rocking horse. You can't tip it side to side. Otherwise, things happen. Maybe you'll end up in the ED. So rocking, like sliding, will put things in the middle of the picture or will center our anatomy. But again, when we're rocking, we change the angle of inclination. So this is a good way to, again, expand the field of view. So you can see here, things stay the same shape, but we are changing the angle of inclination and we bring our anatomy into the center of the picture. So sliding is perpendicular to the target, and rocking changes the angle of inclination, expands the field of view, but it can also be used to bring those structures that are right at the edge of our probe into the middle. Movement along the Z axis is compression. You push. And what happens when we push is that we bring our probe closer to our target. And for some things, it means you're squishing the superficial anatomy. So compression has to be used very carefully. Pretty much anything on the trunk, you need to push hard. We need to bring our probe closer to our target so that the sound doesn't have to travel as far, so that we get better resolution of the returning signal. But if we're doing peripheral things like a shoulder bursa that has fluid in it, or looking at arteries and veins, if we use too much pressure and compress too much, we can actually squish the fluid away from us, or we can squash the veins. So you need to be very careful about how you use compression. As I said, anything trunk-wise, it's usually push firmly. anything peripherally is be light. Try not to squish the gel. When you put pressure on, you can see here, you're maintaining the same view, but you just are squishing things. And so this can distort the image a little bit, depending on how much pressure you're using. Another one around the x-axis is rotate. And when I'm talking about rotate, this is the 90-degree movement that takes us from a longitudinal image to a transverse image of our target. And it's important to understand that rotation is around the center point of the probe. Now, when I started learning, I couldn't for the life of me rotate on ovaries. I would lose them every time. And I wish someone had shown me this trick. I get particularly my novice learners to hold the probe, bring in their other hand to rotate on the same point. Now, as they get better, you can do that without bringing in the other hand. But when they start, this is about encouraging the correct probe grip and also making sure that they spin on the center point and keep their probe grip in a nice ergonomically friendly position. So when we rotate on a structure, we take it from longitudinal view to a transverse view. So they're the 6 probe moves that are discussed in the paper that David Boehner wrote in 2016. The one I'm adding to the mix is pivot. And pivot is rotation around a different center point. So like this door handle, one end is fixed and the other end moves. So we can look at our image and decide, well, which side's not quite lined up with our target anatomy? Is it the probe marker side or the non-probe marker side? So I have a couple of examples to illustrate this. And this particular probe move is one that I get them to practice on our vascular access phantoms, particularly if I'm doing cardiac work and obstetric work. If they understand this movement and can do this movement readily, then they're going to be able to get a crown rump length BPD or the longitudinal views of the heart. So here we are on a vessel. If I keep the probe marker side fixed and swing the other end or pivot the other end, then the corresponding image will be that the probe marker side will stay in view and we lose the view of the other end. We're a little bit oblique on it. So as the instructor, you can look at the image and you can go, well, which side's right? Is it the probe marker side or the non-probe marker side? And then you can figure out which side your student needs to move. If we can do it from the other side as well. So the non-probe marker side stays still and we pivot the probe marker side. And of course, it's just in reverse here. So the non-probe marker side stays in focus and we lose or go oblique on the other end. Now, the way that this plays out for cardiac, if it's the probe marker end here, we will lose our view on the great vessels. So you lose the aorta. And then by pivoting back, you get the aorta back in view. And likewise, the other end, if we hold the apex end of the heart, the base end of the probe marker side at the base end of the heart, if we hold that one still and pivot the other end, we'll foreshorten our ventricle or go oblique on our ventricle. And so the ventricle will turn to be like capping and will go round rather than being that nice sort of triangular shape. The same thing works in obstetric scanning. So depending on how your crown rump length is, what the image will look like. We keep the head in view and pivot the other end, or we keep the bum end in view and we lose baby's head. So this is nuances of that rotate maneuver. It is anchoring one side, and this will solve a lot of problems. This is fine tuning and optimizing your images so that you are aligning the length of the probe to the longitudinal plane of your target. So those 7 moves, we use sweep and fan. Sweep and fan will create the scan and will build up that 3-dimensional picture. It happens in both the longitudinal plane of the organ and in the short axis plane of the organ. We need to sweep and fan in both planes. That's movement across the width of the probe along the x-axis. Slide and rock will position things or center the anatomy. It changes our position relative to our target. depending on whether we're keeping perpendicular or changing our angle of inclination. Along the Z-axis, we have compress and rotate. And the little lonely one down here is pivot. So tip number 3 is to make sure our student understands what words we're going to use. And the thing with that is that you need to explicitly teach the probe moves. Who would have thought? And I didn't for a long time in my teaching career. We just got going. Let's get in there and just start scanning. But I assure you, if you take some time to explicitly teach the probe moves, make sure they're on the same page as you, using the same language, it does make your teaching journey so much easier, and it makes it easier for your students as well. Now, part of the reason for that is that if you have a novice learner, there is so much happening and they're on cognitive overload. If they have to translate what you mean every time you give them an instruction, they're spending their time translating the probe move rather than actually getting the picture that we need. And so not only do you need a common lexicon, but you need to have time to dedicate to a probe skills practical. This is where you're putting theory into practice. So I personally don't think it's good enough to go, hey, 5 minutes, here's what the moves are, because they just nod and then move on, and it goes in one ear and straight out the other. In our courses, and bear in mind, sometimes we only have 2 days with our learners. Maximum we have 4 or 5 days with our learners. I always take the time to spend about an hour teaching them the probe moves. Now that might be, we're doing this on a vascular access phantom, which I found works really well because it's just a tube. So it's short axis or long axis, and it allows that fine tuning of that pivot move. But often we'll start a prac on a patient, and I tend to use the bladder and the kidney. I use the bladder because it's square and it's in the middle and it's a consistent size and shape, and it's aligned with the long axis of our body. And then I use the kidney because it's slightly off skew, and then it encourages them to understand how those probe moves relate to this organ that's on a slightly oblique plane. Now, what I do first is I go through those probe moves and I'm just giving the instruction while they practice. And I close the machine so that they can't see, and I want them to watch their hand. What I'm trying to do here is build hand-eye coordination. And I don't want to overlay that process with an image that they're already trying to interpret what the patterns are doing and trying to figure out what does all that mean. I just want them to understand those moves. So we rehearse it a number of times so that they can just instinctively respond to the instructions that I'm giving. As I said, I start with the bladder because it's in the middle. It aligns with our long axis. And so everything is square and plumb and quite easy. And then I move on to the kidney because it's slightly off skew. And then they need to practice moving along the length of the probe rather than up and down on the body. And they need to understand that difference. So that leads me on to tip number 4, which is to break it down. Now this is break it down into small chunks for your learners, but also break it down into consistent, repeatable instructions for yourself. It's important that we encourage our learners to isolate the probe movements. I want them making one movement at a time so that they can see action and consequence. As a tutor, the single biggest help for me in figuring out how to give instructions to my students was for me to write my instructions down. Now, I don't know if anyone's ever tried to write instructions for how to tie a shoelace, but it's a really interesting exercise if you feel you're up to it. It is particularly difficult. It's the same thing for many of the things we teach. How do I get a longitudinal image of the gallbladder? So where do I start? I position the probe in the midline and I follow the costal margin and slide kind of inferiorly or obliquely down the belly to the mid-clavicular line. Then I need to rock my probe up to get the anatomy in the middle of the picture. And then I align the long axis of my probe with wherever the gallbladder is sitting. So it's a bit of a rotate or a pivot maneuver. Now, if you practice writing down the instructions and then getting a novice user to follow them word for word, you'll figure out which bits you forget. But the process of doing this actually helps you to be very concise in your instructions, but it helps you to figure out what the heck it is that you're doing when you do a scan. Now, most of us are scanning just instinctively now. We've gone through that process. We're way at the other end of the learning pathway, and we just intuitively get our pictures, and we drive our students nuts because we just pick up the probe and go, oh, here it is. But what we need to do is to make those probe movements really conscious and be really systematic in how we're describing the moves to get the image. The thing about writing it down is clarifying those instructions. And the thing that we try to do too for a novice learner, they need more rules and they need a consistent way that they can try every single time. Now, I know that there's many ways to skin a cat, and there's many different ways to getting an image of a particular structure. But if we can stick to one method at first and let them try to master one method at first, and as they build their skills, then we can show them these other methods that might work for, someone who's more difficult. So I tend to start with the method that will work for 85% of my patients. It's not going to work for everybody, but if I can start with the most common and consistent method that I use for most people, and then I'll teach them plan B and C down the track once they have some skills under their belt. Along those lines, I think it's really important just to teach one view at a time. And so, today's task might be we're going for the gallbladder. We just want to get a longitudinal image of the gallbladder. Now, if you've got a novice user, that's enough for today. There's no point in overwhelming them and giving them, hey, here, and I've done this before as a teacher, we're just going to scan the abdomen. They're on overload. They don't take much home. They go home and looking a little bit cross-eyed, and it's not actually productive or efficient or even satisfying for the learner because they're just struggling all day. Tip number 5 is to explain your purpose. Adult education theory states it's important for adult learners to know why they're doing something. So as you try to get the view, it's important to explain why you make each move and what order you're doing it. Why is it in that order? So for example, here's the landmark that we're starting with. Then I'm moving here, here, and here. These are the 3 probe moves that I'm trying to make to get this view. If you can explain your purpose and explain the why are you starting where you are? Why are you doing it in that sequence? Are you approaching it this way to avoid common artifacts? Is it easier to recognize a certain landmark? For example, when I teach the BPD, or how to measure the BPD of the fetal head, I get my students to start in a short axis view of the stomach somewhere. Make the abdomen round. If the abdomen is round and they move towards their head, they're almost in the right plane most of the time. And then it's just fine tuning those movements once you get to the fetal head. Get your falx straight is next. And then put your head in the middle of the picture. And then let's play with the rotation to get the right landmarks in our view. So having a consistent way and a reason for your approach, a rationale, and making that obvious to your learner helps them to understand why they're doing what they're doing. And the other thing that I think is super important is explaining the what. What does an ideal view look like, and why is that view diagnostic and my picture isn't? Now, I think the way that we most learned, or most of us learned, is that someone said, no, it's not right yet. And you just kept going until they said, okay, freeze there. Now, I did that as a student. It took me months to see the pancreas because no one would point it out. No one would explain why is that view acceptable and that one's not. It all just still looked like grey. And it just took me so long to see the pancreas. But if I can teach my students, you're looking for this landmark, and then this is the probe move you're making. Here's what you're looking for. We need to see the head of the pancreas and we need to see the body lengthening out. We're trying to align the long axis of our probe with the length of the pancreas. So what makes that image diagnostic? What are the depth settings and the gain settings supposed to be like that are acceptable and make it diagnostic? Now, this is all in your mind. You do this and you make 100 decisions along the way as you're scanning. But it's important to make that thinking obvious to our learners. And so, for example, the right upper quadrant view of the EFAST examination. During the scan, we need to be able to demonstrate fluid in the hemothorax. We need to demonstrate underneath the diaphragm so that we can see if there's fluid in the abdomen. We're looking for fluid in Morrison's pouch. We're looking for fluid around the tip of the liver. And we also need to slide inferiorly to look at the lower pole of the kidney. And so we need the depth setting in our right upper quadrant view deep enough when we're looking at that hemothorax. We need to be able to see the spine. So we need the depth set a couple of centimeters deeper than the spine so that we can see if there is a positive spine sign indicating fluid in the pleural cavity. Get used to articulating and explicitly explaining why is this view okay and why is this view not. Because otherwise they just will slowly get there, but it'll take a lot longer and they don't know why they're doing it. And I learned like that for a long, long time. The next thing to think about, tip number 6, is give them an instruction and give them time to process the instruction. Don't rush in too much with the next step, and don't rush in too much to put your hand on because they haven't moved exactly how you want them to. So give them time to process. And if they're still taking a little moment to think through, that's probably good. You want them to be purposefully moving the probe rather than just doing crazy hands and stumbling across the right view. Every step that we take here is about getting our students to purposefully move the probe to achieve the view on purpose. Now, if we use just crazy hands and you just do whatever random order and hopefully a view appears, you freeze it, and then your student is so scared to move because they think, oh, I'm going to lose it, because they've got no idea how they got there. So yes, that process is much slower to start with, but it's important to get your learners thinking about what they're doing and allowing them a bit of space and time to process those instructions and to think through what they're doing. Tip number 7 is repetition. You'll tell them again until you're blue in the face, and that's okay. But we want to be repeating the same instructions so that when we're not there, they can hear our voice going, you're going to do X, Y, Z to get this view. And much like a violinist, I mean, you don't just pick up a violin one day and start to make music. You have to practice and almost overtrain. So you need to practice again and again and again. What I get my students to do is to get the view, and then I ask them to lift their hand off. Okay, get it again, lift the hand off, get it a third time. Now, the second time they get the view, they start to think about how did I actually get there? And the third time, they're just rehearsing those moves. Now, that takes a little bit longer right now, and that's why we're doing one view at a time. Let's make all those probe moves purposeful. Tip number 8 is to use your teaching tools and demonstrate those probe moves with visual aids. So, you know, whether it be a uterus, a heart, or whatever, we've got these probe fan things that we made and had printed up. Happy to send anyone one if you get in touch with us. But we have got these probe torches, we call them, made so that you can visualize where the slice is, and you need to demonstrate here's where you are. Sometimes people, you know, the anatomy is on the inside of skin, you can't see it. And so by using the visual aid, they can start to visualize what's happening, and you can show them where they are and where they need to be so that they understand what probe move they're making. And this is also, it's important to get your students to visualize the anatomy. So when my student is completely lost, the first thing I get them to do is to stop looking at the screen and come and look at their hand. And again, we're making that hand-eye connection to increase the hand-eye coordination. But it's important for them to stop and look at their patient and to think about where the anatomy is so that those moves are purposeful. I have watched students who have been scanning the right kidney, have drifted so far over the abdomen and found a kidney, but it was the left one, and they have no idea where they are on the body. 9 times out of 10, if they're completely lost, and I ask them to look at the patient, what organ are you going for? Where is it located? Where's it long axis? Put the probe there, it will fix their problems. So keep getting them to come back to visualizing the anatomy, moving purposefully, even rehearsing those moves while they're looking at their hand to train the muscle memory before they look back at the screen to get the image. Tip number 9 for the tutors is to stand on the other side of the bed. And again, this was one of the simplest things for me to do that forced me to use my words rather than for me to put my hand on the probe. Now, there's a number of reasons why I do that. It's uncomfortable to keep putting your hand on the probe. But the other thing is, if you're putting your hand on the probe, they're not getting the view you are. And so my favorite teaching tool here, you can see, is the big telescopic pointer, which serves as a reminder. I use it to sort of say you're holding the probe too low and just tap them on their knuckles very gently. Sometimes it's just get to the point where I can just open it up and they realize, oh, my hand's too high, get it down. But this telescopic point is great for being able to reach across the bed without having my armpit in the patient's face, but pointing out the anatomy or using it to point to where the buttons are. Obviously, when you're on the other side of the bed, everything's further away. So having the pointer actually helps to aid your learners, but it also forces you to put into words what the instructions are. And my very last tip is as a last resort, as a very, very last resort. For the student who is just not getting it, that's when I'll put my hand on the patient or hand on their hand. I don't do this very often at all. One, as you can see in this image, you have to get up close and personal to your student. Now, some people are not comfortable with that. You've got to factor in all these other sort of social dynamics as well. So before I am putting my hand on the probe, I explain, I just need to come in close. Are you okay with that? Get their permission. And then I put my hand on their hand. Now, what happens a lot of the time, as soon as I put my hand on their hand, they just kind of surrender control and go, oh, you get it. And then they stop thinking about what you're doing. And so what I do is put my hand on their hand and I give them the instruction. I want you to hold the probe and I want you to feel what I'm doing. And then I show them how to get the view. And then I repeat the movement and I give them an instruction. This is what we've done. These are the probe moves we've done. And then as I'm finished, I pick their hand up with mine so that it comes off the patient. And then I encourage them to get the view on their own. Now, the reason I do that is so that it's not just me who's got the view. I mean, I can help anyone to get to the view that we need, but what have they learned if I've done it? So this is for showing them and demonstrating the subtle nuance of some of these probe moves when your learner just isn't understanding how fine-tune a move that we need, or they don't understand how far we need to go. So it is only used in real desperation as a last resort. And as I said, ask permission, put your hand on their hand, instruct them. I want you to feel what I'm doing with the probe so that they tune in rather than just switch off and let you get the view. Explain it and then pick up your hand, ask them to get the view again for themselves and then to practice it. So they're my top 10 tips. The first one was teach the fundamentals. And this is the stuff that's just so obvious, but it's important to actually go through that stuff. Use clear and concise language and have your whole team be on the same page with that language. Make sure the student understands the language that you're using. And so that means that you have to go through and explicitly teach it, but I'd also encourage you to dedicate at least an hour for any novice student. Dedicate at least 3/4 of an hour to an hour to just practice and rehearse those probe moves so that they can understand action and consequence. Tip number 4 was to break it down into smaller bits so that you're only doing one bit at a time, but practice writing down your instructions so you get real clarity about how you're going to give that instruction. Explain your purpose. Why are you doing things? And what does good look like? And why is it good? Versus that's non-diagnostic because of X, Y, Z. Give your learner time to process your instructions. You're going to need to repeat, and your learner needs to repeat. It's the repetition that actually helps them learn. Tip number 8 was to use visual aids and demonstrate what you're doing with the visual aids, like the probe torch and the doll or the liver or the heart or whatever teaching tool you have there. Tip number 9 is stand on the other side of the bed. And the last resort is tip number 10, which is put your hand on their hand, but cue them appropriately to tune in to what you're doing. So that's what I've got for you for today's episode. If you found this episode useful or helpful in any way, please feel free to refer your friends and colleagues to the resources section on our webpage at www.ultrasoundtraining.com.au. And if you want to learn more about how to improve your teaching skills and accelerate your learners' progress, then check out our Trust course. It's the Train the Ultrasound Trainer program. As I said, this is being held in Melbourne later in the year on October the 22nd and 23rd, but we can also bring it to you and your team wherever you are. And now I get to throw it over to you, the audience. Who's going to start me off with some comments or some questions?
Suean, that was really excellent. Thank you. I think I love that thing about standing at the end on the other side of the bed and being able to, and that shoelace analogy.
Yeah.
And I think writing down the instructions, I think that is the tricky thing. We're always so tempted to put our hand where the student is and guide them, and then breaking down. Yeah. So do you give a didactic lecture as well first about the pro movements before you get them to do the practical?
Yeah. So typically now our didactic lecture is sort of a combination of, here we talk for a bit, and then they've got the vascular access phantom with the handhelds and they practice. So I give them, okay, we're sweeping and fanning. Hey, have a practice. Okay, sliding and rocking, have a practice. And so it's interspersed with stuff on a very simple phantom, which is a tube, which is clearly in long or short axis. And then we move out and do that on a patient. And as I said, our probe manipulation prac is bladder first. I do a round of probe moves, like we're in a group of 4. So I do a round of probe moves with no screen, and I'm just giving them the instructions. And it's almost like Pavlov training. I just want them to respond and have it so automatic that they're responding to the instruction. So we do that, each takes a turn. By the time they've heard it 4 times, it's starting to sink in. Then we do the exact same thing again, but with the screen. And now we're just watching the action and consequence and tuning into what happens on the image. And then I go up to the kidney. And this is all about aligning with the length and now making sure your movements happen along the length of the probe. And can you isolate it? Can you just rock rather than sort of drifting as well? And then I come back, and the last thing I do is kind of flip the screen and flip it and show them if they turn their hand around or the probe around the wrong way. Now, sometimes at that stage, it's making sense that it's the wrong way, but sometimes it does take a little bit longer. But it's a really structured method for sort of training those probe moves. And as I said, for us, that meant our learning outcomes are happening on day 2 that used to take until day 5. So it makes a huge difference. And the other thing that our tutors, so we do a lot of coaching here and do one-on-one sessions, and they may not have been to a course and had that lesson. And so my tutors have come back to me this year and kind of gone, every single person that comes in for coaching is going to get the probe moves before we start, because otherwise the day of training is wasted because you're constantly trying to figure out what they mean. So we go through that with everyone that we teach now.
Yeah, we usually when I give the lecture before the practical session, I get them to take out their mobiles. But GE have this stress probe now, which is really great. So I managed to, at our last course, I managed to ask GE to give it to every single student, so that basically during the lecture, the didactic bit, they could just practice it on their thighs or on their arms or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sorry I have to go, Suean. I need to go set up for my chest drain part 2 teaching.
No worries.
Okay.
Thanks so much for joining us,
really
Chris.
excellent. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Look forward to the rest recording. Bye.
Thanks. On the line, Philippa has asked, how do you stop a student from taking multiple images? I think the first thing is they need to, and this is about the tip 5 or something, where I said explain the what, explain the why of what you're doing. If you be explicit in giving them an instruction, this is what I am very specifically looking for to say that this is a diagnostic image. A lot of the time they're taking several pictures because they don't know, they're trying to just cover their bases. And so you end up with 100 pictures and a whole lot of garbage. But if they understand what the criteria are for a diagnostic image, what makes it acceptable, what makes it not acceptable, and what we need. I've only kind of come to realize this probably in the last 12 months or so, that you actually have to explicitly go through that. Like I'm making those decisions and kind of going, yeah, that's not good enough. And I just say, no, not there, and move on. Whereas if I say, that's not working for me because the depth is not deep enough, I can't see X, Y, Z, then they understand what is the criteria for success. So it's as much about saying that's good because, or that's bad because. And if they understand those diagnostic criteria and what makes it a good image, then they will slowly start to not take hundreds of pictures to cover all their bases. I'm just scrolling through the questions on the side here too.
Hello, my name is Asfar. I'm from Toronto. I am a nephrology POCUS fellow. I did have a question. You mentioned about the best image, for example, when you're imaging a kidney or a gallbladder. I just wanted to know if there are any resources there where you find what is the actual best image that we are exactly trying to look for. Like which is the appropriate depth, which is the appropriate sort of a gain, because so many times you do it and people tell you, oh yeah, this one is good enough for you. But is there a sort of a resource for people so that they can sort of see that you know what, this is what exactly I'm trying to get there?
That's a really good point, and I should have probably mentioned this in the talk. We have an image series exemplar for most of our examinations. So for example, gallbladder, here's the minimum series of pictures, or the minimum number of pictures I want you to take. And here's a picture of those images on the perfect patient. Now, not every patient is perfect, but you'll find that this helps in a number of ways because, and this goes to address Philippa's thing as well, if they have an image series exemplar of this is what perfect looks like, and then if they understand here's what we're trying to visualize and the purpose of what each image is trying to achieve, if they have that image exemplar, this right when they're first learning, they're spending less time trying to remember what pictures to take, so they've got the cheat sheet, but it also shows here's what I'm expecting from a normal picture on the perfect patient. Your learners will start to very quickly realize when you haven't got the perfect patient. But that's when in person you're kind of going, well, have you demonstrated this anatomy, and this anatomy? Have you tried all the different probe moves? Have you tried changing the patient position? Have you tried respiration maneuvers? If you've gone through the whole list of what to do to fix your picture and you can't improve the image, at some point it is the patient's fault. And so it's about being very clear about defining what's in a good image. And so if you just take a series of pictures and then print them out, laminate them. So we have some cards here that we give to our coaching candidates, so that it's like a quick cheat sheet that illustrates and outlines here's what good looks like on this type of examination.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, cool. We might be able to make some of those available in our POCUS educators and seed support network, and we'll put them up as guides in the and it depends. The ones that we have printed are catering to the requirements of the qualifications and what they have stated as part of the qualification requirements in Australia. So there might be local variations. It depends what your protocol is, but you'd take a series on a perfect patient, print it off, and have it sitting there for easy reference. And it allows the student also to kind of give them self-evaluate and to give themselves feedback on their own images. So it's a really handy tool and a number of funds.
That would be fantastic if you can post that.
Yeah, cool.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions for me? Lynn was saying she's made a probe fan. My first probe fans were cut out of the Kellogg's cornflakes packet. I just had a piece of cardboard and cut out a sector. It can be as simple as that. We've gone to the trouble of having a probe 3D printed with a perspex thing inside. We've attached some perspex to a torch and tied it on somehow. And then we've ended up with these printed out ones that are on Corflute, I think it's called. But whatever you're using, it can be as simple as just a piece of cardboard. But certainly if anyone wants one of these, get in touch and we'll see if we can post one to you.
I don't have a question, but I just want to make a comment. The 10 point is what sometimes I usually start with. Rather than starting with point 1, I used to start with point 10 to hold the learner's hand and do the orientation. Then later I ask that, okay, now you take the probe and demonstrate what I have done, or what I was holding your hand and I was demonstrating. So I think it is good that I adopt your 10 points and see how it goes.
Maybe your back's got less crankiness about it, but I can't kind of maintain that position long enough all day as I'm teaching. I find that it's really uncomfortable ergonomically for me, and I got a sore back. So it's kind of, you know, old lady disease. I have to be on the other side of the bed so I can see well. But I found that if I'm giving them the instructions, my back thanked me for it a lot. If that's easy for you, that's great. But sometimes you do have to be aware, you know, if it's a guy who's senior and they're getting up close and personal with a very junior doctor or a very junior student, there can be other connotations that come with that and can make for some tricky situations. So, and you know, if you've got a much more longitudinal relationship with your learner, perhaps it's appropriate. But for a number of reasons, I try to use my instructions and use my words rather than getting in there with my hand on the probe. And as I said, now, cranky back and all, it's my last resort for someone who's just not getting it.
Okay. Yeah, I think we are looking forward to maybe inviting you to Cameroon or inviting you to give us a lecture online. We have a number. We have a number of students that we are teaching, and sometimes we were trained in various, in different backgrounds, and having a common knowledge or common word to use while teaching the learners is very important. Yeah. I think we are going to contact you subsequently. And my supervisor, George, was connected. I don't know what happened. He disconnected. So I will discuss with him and I will get back to you. Thank you.
The recording will be up in a few days' time. So okay. It'll be on our website under the resources page, under the Coaching Corner. Okay, well, let's call it a wrap. Thank you so much for joining me. I've really enjoyed putting this one together. I think sometimes the very basics of what we do are the hardest things to teach well. And certainly for me, it's been an evolution over many years and lots of novice users. So I hope that those tips help you and that helps your learners accelerate their progress and helps you not be so frustrated because you're actually giving instructions that make sense and having your learners purposefully move their probe to get the image. So good night, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us.